Meng Haoran, poem sent to old friends while staying overnight in Doglu. In these gloomy mountains, I hear the sad calls of apes. Like the blue river, night flows in quickly. Wind cries in the leaves of both riverbanks. The moon shines down on my solitary boat. Yande County is not my home. I think of old companions in Jiangzhou City. I write out 2 lines of tears and send them far downstream to the west. So here we have a poem, quite a nice poem by Meng Haoran. The topic of the poem is pretty clear, and it's a pretty conventional one, if not of Meng Haoran's production of scholarly poetry production, which is homesickness, being away from home, traveling, and being far away from friends. Travel is a very common topic in Chinese poetry. Scholar officials were, from what we can see in the poems, they were continuously on the move. When they were not in the capital, they were posted to the provinces. And China was an incredibly big empire at this time. And we also have to bear in mind that this was a time before the Industrial Revolution. Transportation was incredibly slow. Even the fastest horses going through the fastest post offices in the empire took, I don't know, 2-3 months to go from, let's say, the capital to the furthest reaches of empire. Travel was nevertheless ubiquitous in the United Empire. Scholar officials were sent to remote provinces to serve in office. They didn't enjoy being far away in the provinces. And travel by boat was considerably faster, but it was limited to big rivers and the Grand Canal. Why are the Chinese scholar officials so insistent on the dreariness of travel? Because we might imagine that traveling might not have been just a horrible experience of homesickness and friend sickness and misery. After all, they were scholar officials. They were, wherever they went, they were kept in, especially if they were holding an official post, they were kept in relative comfort. Well, there are various factors here. So evidently the life in the provinces would have been, compared to the life of the capital, backward, rural, and boorish. Yeah? Contacts with friends, with scholar officials, with people of a like mentality would have been more difficult in the provinces. Then again, we have to resort to cultural elements. We must remember Chinese society was very locally based. Clanic and family structures were very strong all throughout the imperial age. In fact, the legitimation, at least the ideological legitimation of imperial rule, was made through the emperor as father metaphor. Families were very important. Violation of filial duty was considered the most heinous of crimes. Generally they served horrible punishments, and the death penalty, and filiality, obeying the family and being part of the family, was equated with being a good person, being a good citizen, and a good vassal. So being close to family, Confucianism also reinforces this idea, living with your family members, living in the area, in the region that is your family's base, being buried in the family graveyard. All these things are very important for the Confucians and for the Chinese in general, which means, traveling, being far from home, always has this negativity of being uprooted or being cut away from your roots. But anyway, so this is a pretty conventional topic in Chinese scholar official poetry. It's pretty conventional here. Donglu, the place at which this poem is set, is not in the remotest parts of China. It's in Zhejiang, in the eastern coast, just where the Yangtze River ends. And remember, Meng Haoran his birthplace was the middle course of the Yangtze River. You would say, well, it's not that far away. But then again, China is very big. I imagine the distance might be the same as between Lisbon and Rome, to put on a European example. Anyway, the poem, as I've just commented, the topic of the poem is pretty conventional, and it is unhappiness at being far from friends and far from home. And then it also has some slightly landscapey elements because it describes the typical sites, the stereotypical sites in the Jiangsu River at any of its stages, I believe, but probably the reference to gloomy mountains points us to Zhejiang, which, apart from being a coastal region in China, is, I believe, a pretty mountainous region. Okay then, so after this big introduction, let's go as usual couplet by couplet. The first couplet locates us geographically, really. We already know we are at Doglu, the poet is spending the night there. We get some typical natural sights of the Doglu area. In these gloomy mountains, I hear the sad calls of apes. Like the blue river, night flows in quickly. So the poet is traveling by boat. The water, the blue river is flowing. Night seems to be coming as quickly as the flow of the river. We might imagine this region has very, very strong currents. He is surrounded by mountains, which are gloomy, probably it's getting dark, and they're very big, they're very high mountains. And there's a sonic element of disquiet as well. The calls of the apes. This is a conventional image in Chinese poetry, located in the Jiangsu River Valley. There were gibbons, apes that made sounds at night, sounds that were associated by humans with crying. So this is a typical image of sadness in nature. There are a couple of other images: deers crying in autumn, the cicadas. But it's one of the typical images of sadness. Yeah? So we're in a desolate landscape, surrounded with mountains, with a strong river current pushing us forward. The echoes, the sounds of the apes crying or seemingly crying, make a background echo of sadness and melancholy. Second couplet, we continue with natural elements, but this time they are focused in two natural elements: the wind and the moon. Wind cries in the leaves of both river banks. The moon shines down on my solitary boat. This is the second couplet, the first parallelistic couplet, and we get very clearly those contrasts in images. In the first line, we have the wind making a sound, so it's another oral image. The wind is crying in the leaves, so the wind is blowing through the leaves, and the sound feels like crying. So crying of the apes and now crying of the wind in the leaves in both sides of the river. This is also a horizontal image of the wind pushing through the leaves. And then there's the moon shining down. This is a visual image, and it's vertical. So the moon is shining on my solitary boat. Anyway, both images again emphasize the loneliness, the sadness of the environment, which echoes the loneliness, the sadness of the poet. Yeah? We had gloomy mountains, a flowing river, apes crying in the first couplet. Now we have wind crying through the leaves. We have the moon shining like a beacon on a solitary boat with a solitary poet in it. Okay, next couplet. Now the last two couplets move us from this nature descriptive background to Meng Haoran directly stating his feelings and his thoughts. Jiande County is not my home. I think of old companions in Jiangzhou city. So Jiande County must be the place where Doglu is located. It says, this is not my home. If in case we hadn't already noticed, the poet is homesick, he's missing his home, he's missing his friends as well. This is a poem sent to friends. So we do not know the degree of sincerity in his missing the friends, but it's probably quite sincere. Poor Chinese didn't happily accept, as from what we've said before, didn't feel very satisfied at being far from home and far from friends. So he says, this is not my place. This is clearly not my place. And I'm thinking about other places. We might think that he's thinking of home, but he doesn't mention home. He mentions Jiangzhou city, because there was where he was in the past with his old friends. He had stayed probably at the city of Jiangzhou for some time, and he was writing probably this poem to friends who were still living in that area, in Zhangzhou. Now, Zhangzhou is a very important city at this time. It's one of the great cities of China in this period. It's a commercial hub located in the Grand Canal, in the region that unites the big southern river, the Jiangsu, and the northern river, the Yellow River. There's a big canal that unites both of the rivers, and that makes the whole section navigable from the south to the north of China. Zhangzhou was a commercial entrepot, and had been favored by the last emperor of the previous dynasty, Shui Yangdi. It was a city of merchants and of general prosperity. And so, as I said, probably Meng Haoran stopped there for some time and enjoyed the company of friends. He's now writing a poem to them. So he's saying, I'm not in my place. I'm in a foreign place. I'm not home. So I'm happy. And I'm also far from you people who are at Zhangzhou. And I'm also unhappy because of that. Finally, the conclusion, which ends again with a melodramatic, slightly melodramatic from at least my point of view or our point of view, about his sadness at being where he is and not somewhere else. I write out 2 lines of tears and send them far downstream to the west. So this poem and other lines in prose, a letter that might accompany them, are written as if it were not with ink and water, but with ink and tears. The poet is crying. He's writing lines of tears because his tears fall while he's trying to brush the ink onto the paper. He feels sad and forlorn. And he is sending them where? Far downstream to the west. Remember, we said Zhejiang was close to at the end of the Yangtze River Valley, where it joins the sea. So west would have been going west inside the Yangtze, and also west and up, going in the direction of the Grand Canal. And, it's a big river, one of the biggest in the world, so it would have been a big trip for the letter to go back. Meng Haoran wishes to travel with it, whether it be back home or back to his friends, but his letter has to be his substitute. So not a bad poem. As I said, it feels a bit conventional, and, this makes me think of something I've read lately. I've read a history of the reception of Tang Dynasty translations in English in the West. And one of the ideas of the writer of the book, it's a translation of a Chinese book, is that, he or she, or I'm not sure if it's a man or a woman, insists a lot on the misrepresentation, the inevitable misrepresentation of poetry that the cultural divide produces. So it's not only a problem of translating from a language to another language, it's a problem of translating from a culture to another culture. One of the things the translator says is that some poems of some poets tend to be stereotypically preferred because they're for translation, whether because they have few quotations, less cultural background, so they're easier to understand in a translation without using notes. Or sometimes there's a different poetic temperament, like the West likes some types of themes for poetry and not others, and the translator has to try to choose what his audience is going to like. And so the case in point was, it wasn't Meng Haoran, but I'm mentioning it because the Chinese poems have a very common theme in a melancholy tone. Western poetry, I think, has a slightly higher tone, and Western poems about traveling are not about the unrelenting horrors of traveling. They sometimes, they portray traveling in a positive vein, whereas Chinese poems always portray travel in a negative vein. So, there's a cultural explanation for this, which I've mentioned at the beginning of the poem, or before I explained the poem. But I would disagree with the writer of the book, and I think these cultural dissonances can be translated and can be explained. If you can't put it in the poem, you can put it in a footnote, or you can put it in an explanation of a poem like the one I am making. Anyway, that will be all for today. I will talk at another time about, especially when we talk about Baijuji, I will talk about the reception problems and the choice of different texts in the original and in translation, and the different appreciation of some poems in the original and in the translations.